20 miles west of the Scottish mainland, past the last fishing grounds any sailor would willingly cross, a chain of uninhabited islands rises from the Atlantic. The Flannan Isles, 7 jagged rocks, beaten by waves that have been building force across 3,000 miles of open ocean. In 1899, the Northern Lighthouse Board completed a lighthouse on the largest of these islands, Eilean Mor, 75 feet of stone and glass, perched on cliffs 150 feet above the sea. It took 4 years to build. Getting materials to the island required calm seas, strong backs, and uncommon nerve. But when the lamp was finally lit on December 7, 1899, it was considered one of the great engineering achievements of the Scottish Lighthouse Service. 3 keepers manned the light in rotating shifts, 2 on the island at all times, 1 on shore leave on the mainland. It was grueling, isolating work. The island had no natural harbor. Supplies came by boat when the weather allowed, which was rarely. The keepers lived in a small dwelling attached to the tower, cooking their own meals, tending the lamp through the night, and waiting, always waiting, for their relief. On December 15, 1900, a passing steamer called the Archdor noted that the Flannan Isles light was dark. The captain logged it and reported the failure when he reached port. But bad weather delayed any investigation. The relief vessel, the Hesperus, had been scheduled to make its regular run to the island on December 20th. Rough seas pushed the trip back. And back again. It was not until December 26th, 11 days after the light went dark, that the Hesperus finally reached Eilean Mor. What the relief keeper found when he climbed the island's cliffs has never been explained. Joseph Moore was the relief keeper assigned to take his shift on the island. As the Hesperus approached Eilean Mor on the morning of December 26th, the crew noticed something wrong immediately. No flag flew from the flagstaff. No provision boxes had been set out on the landing platform, as was customary to signal readiness for the supply run. And no one appeared at the cliff's edge to greet the approaching vessel. The ship's horn was sounded. No response. A signal flare was fired. Nothing. Moore was put ashore. He climbed the steep path from the east landing to the lighthouse compound. The entrance gate was closed. The door to the living quarters was unlocked. Inside, the clock on the wall had stopped. The fire in the grate was long dead, the ashes cold. An untouched meal sat on the kitchen table, a chair overturned beside it, as though someone had risen in a hurry. The beds were unmade. The lamps had not been trimmed or refilled. Moore called out. His voice echoed through empty stone rooms. He searched the lighthouse from the ground floor to the lamp room at the top. The mechanism was stopped. The wicks had not been cleaned. The last entry in the lighthouse log was dated December 15th. All 3 keepers were gone. James Ducat, the principal keeper. Thomas Marshall, the second assistant. Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, brought in to cover a shift. 3 experienced men. Vanished. James Ducat was the most senior of the 3. A veteran of the Northern Lighthouse Board, Ducat had spent over 20 years tending lights on Scotland's most remote and dangerous stations. He was known as steady, methodical, not easily rattled. He was 43 years old and a father. Thomas Marshall was younger, in his late 20s, serving as second assistant. He had risen through the ranks quickly and was considered competent and reliable. Marshall kept the lighthouse log, a task that would later take on enormous significance. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, a relief man brought in when one of the regular keepers was on leave. MacArthur was a rugged, physically imposing man, a native of the islands who knew the sea as well as anyone alive. He was said to be fearless in rough weather. Locals described him as a man who would never panic. These were not novices. These were not men prone to carelessness or foolish decisions. Whatever happened on Eilean Mor between December 15th and December 26th overcame 3 men who had spent their lives preparing for exactly the kind of conditions the Atlantic could throw at them. When investigators later examined the lighthouse, the most crucial piece of evidence was the logbook kept by Thomas Marshall. The entries painted a picture of increasingly desperate conditions in the days before the disappearance. December 12th, Marshall wrote that severe winds had struck the island. He described the storm as the worst he had ever experienced. He noted that James Ducat had been very quiet and that Donald MacArthur had been crying. December 13th, the storm continued. Marshall recorded that all 3 men had been praying. The entry was unusual. Lighthouse keepers were expected to log weather conditions and operational details, not emotional states. Something about this storm had shaken all 3 men profoundly. December 14th, Marshall noted the storm had ended. The entry simply read that the island was calm again and that God was over all. December 15th, the final entry. Marshall recorded morning conditions as normal. After that, nothing. The logbook raised more questions than it answered. Why would an experienced keeper like MacArthur be reduced to tears by a storm, however severe? Why were all 3 men praying together? And perhaps most troubling, no unusually severe storm was recorded by any mainland weather station during those dates. Ships passing through the area in mid-December reported rough weather, but nothing extraordinary. Nothing that should have broken men who lived their lives in the teeth of the Atlantic. Some researchers have since questioned whether the logbook entries were genuine, or whether they were added after the fact. The originals have never been made available for independent examination. Beyond the logbook, investigators cataloged what they found and what they did not find. 2 of the 3 sets of oilskins and sea boots were missing from the coat hooks by the front door. 1 set remained. This meant 2 men had dressed for outdoor conditions before leaving the lighthouse. The third had gone out without protection, without a coat, without boots, into December weather on an exposed Atlantic island. On the west side of the island, at the west landing platform, there was significant damage. Iron railings had been bent and twisted. A heavy stone block, estimated to weigh over a ton, had been displaced from its position above the landing. Ropes from a crane used to hoist supplies from boats had been torn from their securing points and were found tangled on the rocks below. A life buoy and its securing rope were missing entirely. The east landing, the more sheltered side where boats typically arrived, showed no damage at all. Whatever had happened, it had happened on the exposed western side of the island, the side that faced the full fury of the open Atlantic. The provision box that should have been left at the east landing for the Hesperus was still in the storeroom. The lamp oil supply was adequate. There was food in the kitchen. Nothing suggested the men had been planning to leave the island. Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, conducted the official investigation. He arrived on the island on December 29th, 3 days after Mor's discovery, and spent several days examining the evidence. Muirhead's conclusion was careful and ultimately unsatisfying. He theorized that Ducat and Marshall had gone to the west landing to secure equipment or ropes that were being damaged by heavy seas. MacArthur, seeing something alarming from the lighthouse, perhaps a massive wave approaching, had rushed out without his oilskins to warn them. All 3 were then swept into the sea by a wave of extraordinary force. It was a plausible explanation. It accounted for the missing oilskins, the damage at the west landing, and the overturned chair. It explained why 1 man left without proper gear. And rogue waves, massive, unexpected walls of water that can rise without warning, are well documented in the waters around the Outer Hebrides. But it was not without problems. The west landing sits roughly 100 feet above normal sea level. For a wave to reach the landing platform, let alone sweep 3 men off the cliff, it would need to be of almost incomprehensible size. Such waves do occur, but they are extraordinarily rare, and they leave evidence of their passage: flooded terrain, displaced earth, watermarks far above the tidal line. None of this was reported on Eilean Mor. And there was the logbook. If the men were killed by a sudden rogue wave, why did the log entries from the preceding days describe such psychological distress? What were they afraid of before the wave came? In the century and a quarter since the disappearance, theories have proliferated. The rogue wave theory remains the most widely accepted. Subsequent studies of wave dynamics around the Flannan Isles have confirmed that the islands sit in a zone where wave interference patterns can produce unusually large swells. Waves striking the cliffs from certain angles can send water surging up rock faces to heights that seem impossible. Keepers at other Scottish lighthouse stations have reported waves reaching heights of over 100 feet in extreme conditions. A second theory suggests a more human explanation. Some researchers have speculated about a violent dispute between the keepers, perhaps a murder, followed by suicide or an attempt to flee the island. Isolation, confined quarters, and the relentless pressure of maintaining the light have driven keepers to break down at other stations. But there is no evidence of violence in the lighthouse, no blood, no signs of struggle, and the characters of all three men argued against it. A third theory, favored by some local historians, points to the sea itself, not a single wave, but a sustained assault. In certain weather conditions, the western cliffs of Eilean Mor are subject to a phenomenon where waves compress into narrow channels and explode upward with tremendous force. The keepers may have gone to the west landing to check on damage, been caught by successive waves, and dragged into the sea one by one, each man going to help the one before him. Then there are the stranger explanations. Some have invoked sea creatures, phantom ships, or supernatural forces. The Flannan Isles had long been considered eerie by local fishermen. Before the lighthouse was built, the islands were associated with old Celtic legends, shepherd spirits, enchanted ground, places where men should not linger. Visiting fishermen reportedly refused to spend the night on Eilean Mor, and those who went ashore to hunt seabirds would remove their hats and pray before setting foot on the rock. None of these theories can be confirmed. None can be entirely ruled out. In 1912, the poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson published a poem called Flannan Isle. It imagined the moment of discovery through the eyes of the relief crew, and it gave the mystery its enduring hold on the public imagination. The poem's closing lines asked a question that has never been answered. What made the three men leave the safety of the lighthouse and walk into the storm? The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was automated in 1971. No keeper has lived on Eilean Mor since. The light still turns, a solar-powered beacon now, flashing every 30 seconds, but the dwelling is empty. The kitchen where the cold meal was found is sealed. The rooms where three men slept and prayed and disappeared are silent. The bodies of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were never recovered. No wreckage, no clothing, no remains were ever found on the rocks below the West Landing or washed ashore on nearby islands. The sea around the Flannans keeps what it takes, and the light keeps turning. Not because anyone watches from the tower anymore, but because somewhere, a long time ago, three men were trusted to keep it burning, and then they were gone. The signal remains, but the keepers are hollow.